Hello, this is DC Hammer. So today we launch a new format for the DC Hammer Show, a series of video broadcasts, each laser focused on a particular event, article, or subject. I will be pre-recording and uploading episodes to this YouTube channel as news breaks, as the world turns, and as the deep state deserves another spanking. So let's get right to the episode for today. So, China. We've been reporting for months that the Red Dragon is not only involved in predatory trade, a policy of driving third world nations into debt to the Chi-Coms, that is, and corruption with their Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, but the communists continue their worldwide program of intellectual property theft as China successfully completed its internship during the Clinton administration in the 1990s. The Red Dragon has now matured into an almost unstoppable force of criminal activity under the Chinese concept of Zhuanxi. So what is Zhuanxi? It is the Chinese way of developing relationships that result in the exchange of favors or connections that are beneficial for the parties involved, such as Bill Clinton and Johnny Chung, but not to the country to which Bill Clinton was supposed to have allegiance. But in Chung's case, as all good or bad little communist minions do, he owed all his favors to the Chinese Red Dragon, and thus the American criminal gets rich and the communist state grows richer. Get it? This piece comes to us from China.net. The title, China Pressured on Intellectual Property Theft. In addition to everything the communist Chinese have been doing over the decades, since the 90s, to influence American politics in their behalf, to bribe or coerce or take other action against American officials and others, prominent people that have sway within our borders as far as policy making and corporate decision making and the actual ability to transfer information and property illegally to the Red Chinese. The experts have estimated, according to this article, that China's intellectual property theft cost the United States economy hundreds of billions of dollars, but the cost to China of stopping the violations remains unclear. So, President Trump has made it clear that he is not only going to level the playing field when it comes to trade with the communist Chinese, but also to stop their illegal practices. If you've seen one of the presentations by Peter Navarro, professor from the University of California, Irvine, as he digs deep into not only what the Chinese do in order to get their way when it comes to trade with foreign countries, Chinese have over the decades perfected a multi-pronged attack in order to not just get economic gain through normal business means, but also to spy on other countries in ways that enable them to acquire information and technology that gives them a leg up on whatever it is that they are trying to launch or make better in their own way. They also then steal whatever they can because they've gone unto this point unpunished for decades of what they have done in order to steal the wealth of other nations. National wealth is not just determined by what you have in your bank account. It's also the accumulation, it is the aggregate of all of the wealth that your businesses within your borders generate by the intellectual activity, the expense that they make in research and development, the dedication that they give to growing talent within their own organizations in order to develop software, hardware, military hardware, and then launch those in their own way to protect their own interests. But the Chinese have perfected this method of allowing everybody else on the planet to do heavy lifting, the thinking, the creativity, the launching of new initiatives, and then they come in and they poach it. Reports are done on a yearly basis in order to quantify a lot of the damage being done by countries to other countries. And when it comes to the Red Chinese, a 2017 report from the Independent Commission on the Theft of American Intellectual Property has found that the annual cost to the United States economy continues to exceed 225 billion, 1.5 trillion yuan in counterfeit goods, pirated software, and theft of trade secrets, and it could be as high as $600 billion. That same report names China as the world's principal intellectual property infringer, accounting for 87% of counterfeit goods seized by the United States. And it also pointed the finger at China as the main source of hacking. That I know it's going to be a big surprise to a lot of people that have gone crazy over the last 24 months about quote-unquote Russian hacking. And sure, the Russians hack, we hack, the CIA hacks, the FBI hacks. There's hackers everywhere. There are private citizens that are hackers. Just ask, Guccifer 2.0 and Kim.com and Julian Assange, who kind of started out in the world as a hacker. The Chinese, on the other hand, have rooms full of hackers on a daily basis doing everything they can to hack into American government computers, into the computers of corporations in this country, and to get their hands on anything they can to steal it and take it back to the Red Dragon. At the commission that produced that report, although it can find no reliable data on damage from patent infringement, it estimates the cost of trade secret theft alone from the United States is over $180 billion annually. I guess there may be a reason why President Trump has turned up the heat on the Chi-Coms, on the Chinese communists, and prior administrations have gone out of their way to ignore or to benefit from what the Chinese have been doing all these decades. A country like China does not grow from an insignificant third world country, its main resource being millions and millions of people, but having very little infrastructure and educational processes in order to turn those people into significant contributors to their own economy, have learned that the best way for them to do it is to bring themselves from third world status to preeminent status in the world, is to just continue to steal what they need from everyone else. And although President Trump has turned up the heat and shone the spotlight on intellectual property theft by China, this report says that if you do decide to hold your breath for IP, intellectual property change in China, update your will first. So that's a quote from one of the members of the American Enterprise Institute in Washington. The bottom line being that unless they are dragged kicking and screaming to the table, unless they are caught continuing to do these illegal activities when it comes to the intellectual property theft and are held accountable, the Red Dragon, the Red Chinese will not stop doing what it's doing, because why should they? It only profits them, and as long as they're not held to account, there is no reason why they shouldn't continue. If you have no God, if your God is the God of power and money, if you have learned to value your country's ability to put its boot on the neck of everyone else on the planet and use them as your slaves and serfs to get where you want to go, then why should you stop unless someone forcibly stops you from doing what you're doing? And President Trump is doing whatever he can to peaceably resolve these kinds of issues. And we all pray that he will be able to do so. I had already mentioned the Clinton administration when I started talking about this article. And isn't it interesting that this article also reflects on a starting point for the turn in forced technology transfers, and that being the 1990s. That is no coincidence. This is the period of time when the Red Chinese, the Red Dragon, was able to use its influence in order to start to blackmail or create a pay-for-play situation in order to create an environment in which they would dominate industries, and they are doing so and have honed their techniques over the decades, and the number of transfers over the decades has been worth tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars to China's manufacturing sector, and is an enormous and probably the primary factor in why they have grown into a nation full of manufacturing facilities with plants producing almost anything, any product you can think of, when before they were unable to produce almost anything. The Chinese have both long-term and short-term goals, and they do continual planning, and they come up with additional changes to their business models. And the one that they're working on at this point in time, and they are being extremely successful in pulling off, is their Made in China 2025 initiative, the goal of which is to gain supremacy in all technologies they can, including advanced robotics and artificial intelligence. At times, the Chinese make statements that would lead you to believe that they truly are changing their tune and would modify their techniques in order to create a level playing field, making statements such as indicated in this article, that technology transfer and technology cooperation between joint venture participants are in essence market behavior driven by mutual benefit, and the government does not interfere in this process. Well, that sounds good, but the mutual benefit part of it is the sticking point, in that much of what the Chinese do is always geared towards primary benefit or even sole benefit to the Chinese, and the aftermath of what they do to the quote-unquote venture participant, or I would put the term target on there as a better term, would suggest that statements like this are pure words on paper and not deeds they intend to live by. And just so you understand how this has been put into play by the Red Chinese, the Red Dragon, over the years, is that as manufacturing in China became cheaper than manufacturing in the United States due to labor costs, a lot of American companies moved to China or opened up plants over there. As part of the movement, the Chinese companies were demanding that the American companies moving in to take advantage of the cheap labor would at the same time force those American companies to transfer their technology as a cost of doing business. This is another practice that must be stopped, and as President Trump continues, change the balance of trade and to woo American companies operating abroad, and specifically in China, back to the United States. And as those companies then close their facilities in China, then future technology breakthroughs would not be shared with the Chinese, because those companies would be manufacturing their products back in the United States as they should, and the sharing of their technology with China, as they would have manufacturing facilities in China, would no longer take place. Again, one of the primary advantages that the Chinese have worked out for keeping their costs down and keeping their net profit high is to rely on others to do the research and development that they then benefit from. The Chinese now understand that they have to increase their investment in research and development, as President Trump has reversed the tables on them and is preventing them from continuing to rely upon what they can take from American companies through the American R&D effort. And now that the Chinese need to grow their own R&D culture, it is going to need to rely upon domestic as in Red China, for its own intellectual property development in the future. The irony of this is, of course, that as the Chinese now realize that research and development is something that they will have to pursue in the future if the United States continues to go down the path of returning its manufacturing to its own country, while at the same time putting the clamp on the exportation of research and development intellectual property outside of its country as part of the blackmail scheme that's been in place with the Chinese, as they demanded the technology transfers take place for American companies with manufacturing sites in China. And now that the tables have been turned, they are increasing their clampdown on intellectual property violations in their country. So, as long as the Chinese were able to steal intellectual property from other countries, punishment wasn't the main issue. But now that intellectual property theft is an issue and China has to address it, the activity in Chinese courts dealing with intellectual property theft, they are cracking down on the intellectual property theft issues within their own borders. And even if Chinese courts are now starting to crack down on some of the intellectual property theft issues, this article then goes on to say that while the cost to China of stopping IP theft may be impossible to determine, Reinsch, who is with the Center for Strategic International Studies in Washington, William Reinsch, believes that the government may not be reluctant. There's a double negative there. In other words, he believes that the government will not take meaningful action against it. The second part of this story involves the corruption that's been created through this entire process. In addition to intellectual property theft, one of the other initiatives that the Red Dragon has used over the years, increasingly so under President Xi, is this Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI. I mentioned that at the beginning of this video. It's a method that they use in order to corrupt other countries and to throw money at the leaders of other countries, to use despots and crooks in order to further China's infrastructure projects that are carried out within the borders of those other countries. One of the prime examples for the understanding of this comes from foreignpolicy.com. The prime example is Malaysia. The Chinese, the Red Dragon, approached Malaysian leader Najib Razak years ago and presented him with a deal he couldn't refuse, and that was that the Red Chinese, were willing to loan Malaysia the necessary funds in order for them to start implementing infrastructure improvements within their own country, as reported by Will Doig in this report. But since that relationship was developed between Red China and Malaysia, Prime Minister Najib Razak was shown to be completely corrupt, and that he had created this relationship with Red China not to truly benefit his own country, Malaysia, but to benefit himself. And so as billions of dollars in infrastructure projects were coordinated between Communist China and the country of Malaysia, hundreds of millions of dollars in bribes and payoffs were being provided by the Red Chinese back to Razak. But this was found out by people in his own country, and he has been forced out of office as of May in 2018. And the new regime has just realized the unbelievable damage that has been done to Malaysia by their former leader, Razak, and the relationship that was formed with the Chinese. The Chinese use their own banks in order to loan the money that is necessary in order for these enormous infrastructure projects to start to take place. As the ground is broken, progress payments are due back from the country in which the construction is taking place to Communist China. And since these are poor countries who had to break their own budgets in order to get these projects off the ground, when it comes to starting to pay back the loans that have been made by the Chinese banks, they either immediately default or go into bankruptcy, or continue then to push themselves into even deeper debt by rolling over what they are supposed to be able to pay back. But it's obvious that they'll never be able to pay this back, and this is just a giant Ponzi scheme used by the Red Chinese in order to create a debtor nation, and which would then quickly become a slave nation. There are two beneficiaries through this process: the Communist Chinese and whatever official of these countries that are targeted by the Red Chinese. In this case, it's this single individual, Razak. In the case of the United States, you could take a look at, perhaps Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, Dinosaur Dianne Feinstein. I would say there's a bunch of names. There are several names that you could push out there if you were to truly explore what has happened in the relationship between Chinese officials and members of the American government and the American industrial leaders. What this report points out is that there's tangible proof that China exploits and corrupts regimes to propel its Belt and Road Initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative, as you see in this Wikipedia piece, comes from the thinking of returning China to its roots in commerce back to the time of the Silk Road. So in other words, it's created a 21st century solution to a trade path that was used centuries ago. As you can see by the article, the Silk Road is not just a road. It is it's a plan for China to start out dominating that part of the globe in which China exists, Asia, Europe, Africa. In order to do that, what they have embarked upon is a plan that has several tentacles. It's like an octopus. If you see the red state of the red dragon, and it has its tentacles sticking out, the black and blue lines, they have not only a Belt and Road corridor, 6 of them stretching out over land masses, but also in the blue you see the maritime Silk Road, and that is part of what they're doing with the island building in the area right near Indonesia on the map, but also their plan then to dominate areas all the way over to Africa and to Europe by using their techniques that they have developed for infrastructure improvement offerings through the Chinese banks, compelling the use of Chinese leadership in those projects, and then coming down like a ton of bricks on those countries, especially the third world countries that can't fight back, when the debt that's been created, the projects that have begun, in order for those projects to be continued or completed, then requires that the Chinese take an ever-increasing role in not only the completion of that project, but the actual running of that country itself. As indicated in this report, many of the countries that receive these BRI investments suffer from high levels of corruption. Gee, who'd have thunk that? And as the Red Chinese continue throughout the world to spread the bribery and corruption in order to achieve their aims, unless you have strong accountability mechanisms in place, unless you have media organizations that will call them out as issues arise from what they are doing with their projects and the way that they approach other countries, if you have a government that truly looks out for the country itself and doesn't allow the Red Chinese or others to unduly influence what's taking place within their own borders, then these conditions can't exist. But if you have no accountability measures or weak ones, you have compliant media organizations that allow these issues to go through either uninvestigated or unreported, and you have authoritarian governments that don't permit dissent, and so the leaders of those countries can get away with anything they want. Can you say what would have happened if Hillary Clinton had become president in November of 2016? Then the damage that the Chinese is spreading throughout the world would have continued to the point where the world would have collapsed under the weight of the Red Dragon. But that is being turned back. The Red Dragon is being forced back with a fire hose by President Trump and other nationalist leaders who realize if you give in to the corruption and the bribery, you may personally make out, but you've sold your soul, and you've also sold your country and everyone else within that country on a path to destruction. And as long as you have the morals in order to stand up for what is right for your country instead of what's in your own personal best interests, unless you get on the Trump train, then the alternative is to get on the Belt and Road Initiative path to destruction. I believe, though, just as Communist China has realized that it needs to clamp down on intellectual property theft within its own borders, that was created by the rampant intellectual property theft that individuals within Red China were perpetrating against countries like the United States, since they have grown used to that kind of technique, that they're comfortable in their own corruption. The Belt and Road Initiative has created a climate of corruption in the homeland of China, in addition to the corruption, the environment of corruption it's created in the other nations. So the red Chinese chicken is coming home to roost. As they have spread corruption throughout the entire world, that corruption is then hard to tamp down in their own country, as the people that have been tasked in order to be the people corrupting others throughout the world then find it a comfortable paradigm that they've fallen into to continue to be corrupt at home as well as abroad. And they are going, Red China over the long term will suffer from a culture of corruption. There are many examples of what China is doing around the world, including in continents like Africa and elsewhere. Laos is another, in Southeast Asia, is another example of what has happened. Laos was trying to build a railroad from its northern border with Thailand and took a giant, for them, loan from a Chinese bank, $6 billion project, kind of like building a wall around the southern border between the United States and Mexico. And the former deputy prime minister of the country, Somsavat Lengsavad, interestingly, he speaks Chinese fluently and has close ties to Beijing. Who'd have thunk it? Almost single-handedly ushered in this project, despite warnings that were coming from the International Monetary Fund that if taking on this debt load in order to achieve this project, that its country would not be able to service its debt load. But this individual pushed it through anyway. I would bet if you were to uncover his Swiss bank accounts, you'd learn the reason why. And so now Laos is another country that has taken the BRI road to destruction, and it will be difficult for the Laotians now to pull themselves out of this economic death spiral. The bottom line is, in order for the Red Dragon to succeed in these nefarious activities, they need the tacit cooperation, the participation of people in these other nation states that are targets of their initiatives. And as the United States was fully complicit in a lot that was happening here, the Red Chinese accomplishing what they wanted to achieve by bribing people and turning the United States into a giant playpen. Now that President Trump is in the office and refuses to participate in that activity, we are now turning our country around from this. But it is going to be difficult for all of this activity that the Chinese have unleashed over all these decades, over all these different countries of the world, is just now being uncovered by reporting that is being done by people like Will Doig. And if we don't have more Doigs in the box, if we don't have more citizen journalists and others that are uncovering these nefarious schemes by the Red Chinese, the Red Dragon, and others, we will continue to live in a world that is going down a path that ultimately ends up with all of the nations of the world being slave to a few prominent and the most unethical nations that were, and individuals that were able to use fraud, deception, and cover-up in order to achieve their personal gains. And fortunately, as long as we have President Trump in office, I don't believe we will fall to the same fate as Laos, Malaysia, and other areas of the world. But our diligence needs to be long-term and not related to the administration of a particular president. If our schools are not teaching ethics and the way to conduct business and to put yourself in a proper relationship behind the importance of the nation and in a position of patriotism, if we are not nationalist, if we are globalist, and if we believe that perhaps the way that China actually does things is superior to how we do things, maybe you could get into the mindset of believing that this is actually the BRI is the right road to be on. But I'd prefer the road that takes us back towards freedom, liberty, and ethical behavior instead. And so thank you, Will Doig, for shining the spotlight on this corruption and nefarious activity on the part of the Red Chinese. We'll continue to report on issues that enable us to shine light on this darkness. So to the deep state operatives, our New World Order governing overlords and black hats everywhere, I say repent. Your time is running out. The hammer of justice is headed your way. Abandon the leaking ghost ship while you can. Save yourselves from this wicked generation, for we will never surrender, we will never be silenced, and we will continue to fight on to victory in God's name. So God bless you all. Looking forward to being with you for our next broadcast.